Uh, Aditi, are you there?
Yes, sir.
I am the
Okay,
voice is okay, audio is okay.
it is
I am
okay. Okay, sir. Aditi, just wait for a minute or two. Okay, we
Okay,
have
sir.
given Madam a call. She will be coming within some time. I will give you a note.
Okay,
Right?
sir.
Okay.
Okay.
Tushar Pal, please stop presenting. Tushar Pal, please stop presenting. Aditi, please start.
Am I audible, sir?
You are.
Good morning, one and everyone. On behalf of the Department of English, Bankura Christian College, I, Aditi Hajra, undergraduate honors, semester 6 student of the department, welcome you all to the 13th day of the International Web Lecture Series hosted by the Department of English, Bankura Christian College. Warm greetings and welcome to the dignitaries, faculty members, research scholars, students, and one and everyone present on the virtual platforms, either the Google Meet forum or over YouTube. We are honored today to have two very eminent speakers with us. Dr. Nilanjana Dev, Associate Professor of English, Jadavpur University, and Dr. Richa Joshi Pandey, Assistant Professor of English, Doon University. Before I request Dr. Nilanjana Dev ma'am to go ahead with her deliberation, may I request Dr. N.G. Mukherjee sir, Reader, Department of English, Bankura Christian College, to formally introduce Dr. Nilanjana Dev ma'am. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Aditi. Thank you for giving me this opportunity of introducing an erudite scholar, a very popular teacher throughout West Bengal, Dr. Nilanjana Dev. Dr. Nilanjana Dev is Associate Professor of English at Jadavpur University. She was a recipient of the Shastri Indo-Canadian Fellowship twice and Indo-Australian Fellowship. Her fields of specialization include post-colonial literatures, Aboriginal literatures, cultures of protest and diaspora studies. She was a core group member of international collaborations of the Department of English, JU, such as Envisioning the Indian City and Commodities and Culture in the Colonial World with the University of Liverpool and King's College London, respectively. She led the human ecology team at JU under the Indo-European collaboration Project Equal. She recently completed a British Library funded project on digitizing the endangered archives of the British India Association. She has been engaged in several projects on labor migration through the colonial port of Calcutta 1840 to 1947. She is presently co-investigator in the Rusa 2 project at Jadavpur University on bodies of difference, which reaches out to urban, peri-urban, and rural schools to develop pedagogical tools and resources to sensitize teachers as well as students on how to deal with bullying on grounds of gender, caste, sexuality, ethnicity, disability, and other forms of difference. So let's now go over to Dr. Niranjana Dev. I request Niranjana ma'am, to start her deliberation, please. Ma'am.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, Professor Mukherjee. Could I just get a sense of how much time I will have on hand? Do I have?
Ma'am,
around an hour.
Yeah, an hour you will have, ma'am, and thereafter we can have the interaction session. Okay, ma'am?
Okay.
And I request all the participants here to kindly mute their audio and also to turn off their video, please. And
please cooperate with Dr. Dev. Yes, thank you. Ma'am, over to you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to meet the students of Bankura Christian College. I hope that in better times, beyond the pandemic, I will be able to meet you all in person physically. There is no replacement for one-to-one interaction between teachers and students. For now, the internet provides a kind of unsatisfying substitute. Though one might say that through the internet, and particularly through this format of the internet seminar and online lectures, one is able to actually reach out to many more people than one would physically if one had to actually physically have people coming over to a seminar. I speak today on a subject which is both familiar as well as unfamiliar to me, in that I have been working, as Professor Mukherjee said, on the stories of migrant workers, particularly those who came from places like Bihar, Orissa, what is now Madhya Pradesh, and other states of the Gangetic Plains, and traveled through the port city of Kolkata as indentured workers, traveling by ships to plantation colonies, particularly colonies that grew sugarcane around the world, the so-called old Indian diaspora or coolie diaspora. And so the landscape of a colonial Kolkata, populated not so much by the Bhadraloks and the Babus, but by the coolies constantly flowing into the city and then being shipped off to other locations. That landscape, of a different Kolkata is not entirely unfamiliar to me from my archival work. And yet, today I want to link it with what I think all of us have been deeply, deeply moved and disturbed by, which is the tremendous displacement and suffering of migrant workers in our country who, with very little notice, were suddenly expected to cope with the severe curtailment of facilities and mobility during the COVID-19 lockdown. Um, if if you put yourself in their place, you realize that that choice between staying on in the city and or picking up luggage, small children, and taking the long road home, sometimes on foot, bicycle, rickshaw, whatever was available. That traumatic decision is something that is uh, one that those of us who are located in middle class, lower middle class, or elite, positions in society will need to think a little deeper to understand. It is something that we need to understand, the fact that the histories of our nation have always been the histories written from the middle class perspective, the perspective even from the colonial period through to the post colonial period, the current era of neo imperialism. We've always had the histories of the nation written from the point of view of the Savarna Bhadralok, the upper class, upper caste historian who writes what might seem to be a homogeneous history of the nation. And yet we know that from the 60s onwards, in the discipline of history itself, uh, the notion of history from below has emerged. Um, the work of Eric Hobsbawm and other historians, the emergence of working class histories, the emergence of women's histories, the emergence of queer histories, histories of people of color in living in third world conditions in the first world, migrant histories, all of these have emerged as in a sense, a democratization of the discipline of history itself, and perhaps an attempt to democratize the master narrative of the nation's past as well. Having said that, I think that one of the things that I'm hoping that will happen in the coming years is that the university educated, college educated middle class of India living in towns and cities will wake up to the fact that perhaps instead of just working on conventional historiography, conventional, or facilitating the creation of uh, mainstream narratives, perhaps we need to encourage and undertake more research on the migrant worker, on the working classes. And here, even in your area, in Bankura, many workers, many migrant workers have returned from work in big cities, not just Kolkata, but from other parts of India. And it is perhaps uh, necessary to understand that suffering from the illusion that they have all now returned home and are quarantined, so the problem is over. I do not think the problem is over. I think the problem has only become visible in a greater sort of quantum than it was visible before. The problem is not the migrant worker. The problem is the lack of sensitivity of the middle class and ruling elites of India. The problem is the lack of support systems and welfare services for the working classes, and particularly for the unorganized labor sector. Now, most of you, even if you're not from economics backgrounds, are completely, I think, aware of what unorganized labor means. It means labor that has not been able to unionize, to organize, and therefore to agitate even for better working conditions, for more rights and welfare services. And that sense of being unorganized renders the migrant worker and other unorganized sector workers, for example, rag pickers, those who collect the waste produced by cities and large towns. Um, in all of these cases, there is very little by way of security. There is very little by way of any kind of backup. I mean, think of the fact that, even if they've somehow managed to get on a Shramik train and get home, even if they've managed to somehow, find a way of, getting back to their home village or hometown, many of these migrant workers are currently without a job. So even if they do get those, 5 or 10 kgs of free rice from the central or the state government, there is really a huge uh, shadow of uncertainty hanging over their lives. And that is about where is their, you know, next month's salary going to be coming from. And this is where I think we need to understand why the phenomenon of the migrant worker has become such a widespread, large scale phenomenon. It is directly linked with capitalist modernity. It is directly linked with the fact that capitalist modernity sees the phenomenon of the city, the large city, the phenomenon of increasing urbanization as a way of more efficiently controlling, enabling, and providing goods and services from the corporations and the state to the citizen. So, in that sense, the very existence of the large city, or now this term, the mega city, right, or the fast growing large towns of India, the tier 2 and tier 3 cities and towns, in all of these, there is a need for facilitating through the development of infrastructure more and more goods and services against taxes in the case of the government, or a price in the case of corporations that are providing certain goods and services. So, we are living in an era where urbanization has become central, in a sense, to our very vision of development, our very vision of how the future of this country should be, indeed, of many Asian countries like India should be. So the fact that, a city or a large town needs to become a logistical hub, right, is something that requires a lot of labor. And what is the labor for? Because a city is essentially an extraction site. You don't particularly think of a city as a site that somehow replenishes the soil or replenishes water, or in any way repairs the environment. It is primarily and efficiently an extraction site, meaning that uh, it is a site which constantly needs to sustain itself a huge amount of energy, primarily from non renewable resources. It needs, and indeed completely then renders poisonous, a huge amount of air. It creates a lot of heat, unwanted heat in the era of global warming, because if any of you live in an area where a lot of people switch on their air conditioners, you will know what we mean when we say that the concrete city becomes a heat island, right? Which then needs more air conditioners to keep the inhabitants cool. Soil, water, and other, any number of resources. Um, and who is going to provide the labor? Uh, the other thing is, of course, that as more and more people keep moving into the cities, um, you will find more and more high rises, gated colonies coming up, and this entire web of infrastructure that I am describing is something that literally rides piggyback on migrant labor. Because, and at some point in my talk, I will try to distinguish between, the notion of the slum dweller, somebody who's actually for 2, 3, or even more generations been living in city slums and not likely to leave the city to go home in case of a crisis like the one we just faced during the lockdown. The slum dweller is different from the migrant worker who, as we have seen in the kind of situation where they're not being able to pay rent, they're not being able to keep up their cost of living because of the lockdown, uh, the migrant worker chooses to return home. And let's keep that in mind. I'd like to talk about, the reason I chose this as the subject of my talk is perhaps to encourage some of you to, go out into, not now, of course, when it's a little safer for you to do so, to go out into, the town, to go out into the surrounding villages, and if possible, do oral histories of the migrant workers who chose to return home, and many of whom you may find who have decided not to return to the big cities but try for a living somewhere in the area around their home village. So, if you were to do work on the idea of labor, particularly migrant labor, which would be a way of correcting, I think, the huge wrong that we educated, college educated, university educated people have done in being silent and being, in a sense, unseen, of the lives of working class people, of peasants. Perhaps that wrong might be corrected through the research that you do, the research and writing that you do. So, if you were to think about working on labor migration, particularly the migrant worker, you would need to understand that there are several theoretical perspectives from which you can do this work. So, before leaping straight into a comparison of migrant labor in the colonial period and migrant labor in neoliberal Kolkata, I'd like to you know talk about the theoretical strands that you know have become, as it were, the main lines along which research on migrant labor in India has happened over the last few years. So there is the neoclassical sort of historian's way of looking at migrant labor, which focuses on the individual's power of decision making, the migrant laborer's power of decision making. It's based on theories of modernization that see the individual as a rational actor with the power of choice, choosing that which will give him or her the optimum economic benefit in life. And so here the stress is on things like the pull factors. What is it that attracts, pulls people from their villages to go to the city in search of work? That decision to opt for higher income, possibly for better access to education for their children, and so on. In addition, there is the surplus model, in which the decision to go to the city is determined by the income difference between the city and the rural area. the chance that perhaps if jobs are drying up in the rural area, then there may be more job options in the city. So and also the hope that, once you get to the city, you spend maybe a few years in the informal unorganized sector, and then, if things get better, you can shift to formal employment that has less risk and more security, even though you might be mentally prepared for the fact that this shift from being in the informal unorganized sector to being a you know someone with more formal employment might happen over two generations. You may struggle, but perhaps your son or your daughter who you educate will achieve formal employment. There is another strand, which is the structuralist, more specifically Marxist kind of analysis of migrant labor, which focuses more on the economic and social factors that determine the economic behavior of the migrant worker. So, the structuralist Marxist studies would contend that the poor really don't have that choice. This choice that, okay, I'm going to go to the city, I'm going to do this or that. They don't really have that choice. It is the only option left for survival, and their mobility, or indeed lack of mobility, is not a free choice. There is an element of compulsion involved in that movement or not moving. Uh, and so here we also have the idea of the push factors in migration. So you have factors that push people to the city. So even in colonial India, in the late 18th, 19th century, the early 20th century, we have people moving to the city from their villages because of the humiliation they faced from the caste system. The city would provide a greater degree of anonymity, scope for work outside of the traditional professions in which caste had trapped them. The other factor that pushes people away to the city is often, in fact, related to the caste system, but also to class, which is that of land scarcity and landlessness. I mean, not just the fragmentation of land as the population increases, but the fact that many castes do not own land, are not substantial owners of land, have been working primarily as tenant farmers, contract labor, even in rural areas for a very long time, or indeed as bonded labor. In the colonial period, of course, one major reason for labor movement was underdevelopment by the colonial state. The state didn't want to develop certain areas so that they would be, in a sense, like spaces where labor could be harvested. People didn't have, other jobs, and so cheap labor would always be easily harvested from those places. And of course, of how in the colonial period, and indeed even now, the role of the middleman or the agent in recruiting groups of people from the village and bringing them to the city to various employers. And of course, I talked about the coolies at the very outset. Many people went from UP, Bihar, Orissa, Bengal through Kolkata as coolies, as indentured laborers, contractual laborers, overseas as well. But a very large number also went to the tea plantations, as you well know, from what is now Chhattisgarh, Bihar, UP. You had a very large number of people, including a substantial Adivasi component. Excuse me. That traveled to the tea plantations through recruiters, and many stayed on there. So different industries, different economic sectors had different catchment areas. And this was even reflected in the growing city of Kolkata itself, where different parts of what was then called Black Town, growing into the more Indian dominated parts of Kolkata, had different catchment areas. So, the potters, the artisans, such as the kumars, lived in one particular area, the cobblers lived in a particular area. And I would refer you to Shumanta Banerjee's wonderful book, The Parlor and the Streets, which gives you, uh, in the first chapter, an excellent map of this sort of demographic arrangement according to professions. A lot of people came into Kolkata not just to provide labor for the various large zamindar families. So, huts, clusters of huts developed around the places where the zamindars lived, but also, over the space of the 19th century, as Kolkata became an industrial hub, the development of many shipyards, one of which still remains, Garden Reach Shipbuilding, the emergence of a thriving dockland economy, the, the the growth of industries such as the jute mills, for example. All of these brought a lot of people from the rural areas. I remember while doing my research that the deliberate underdevelopment of the rural countryside had led to so much poverty that in one instance, I remember reading a letter in the India Office records of a man saying that just for the price of two pies, he was able to get a man to walk with a heavy load on his head from Bankura to Kolkata. All right, the man was so poor that just for two pies he was willing to do that kind of inhuman work. So the and we, of course, in Shumanta Banerjee's book you hear of the Kangali Bidai ceremony. Many big zamindars would give away money and other things to poor people, and there would be huge crowds streaming in from the local slums and nearby villages in the hope of getting one anna or a little bit of food. Uh, to the extent the crowd would be so dense that small children would suffocate. But the parents would still hang on to those babies, the dead bodies, because showing the dead body would mean that that dead child, would also get one anna from the person giving the donation, an extra bit of money. So I'm not going to the details of this, but you must realize that certain districts, certain parts of the country have traditionally been, you might say, labor donor areas from which a lot of out migration has happened because of landlessness, because of a kind of cycle of poverty that was partly created by the British and in a sense sustained by the caste system. So even within the city, even if one was not an indentured contractual laborer, one would suffer from a lack of freedom, a relation of dependency, of servitude. So, which brings us to the third theoretical strand through which migration studies, the study of labor migration in particular, has happened, which is the subaltern studies school. Subaltern studies historians have suggested that neither the factor of individual choice nor the larger picture of economic conditions is enough to help us understand the ways in which the lives of migrant workers, their livelihood was determined. In order to understand how an individual chooses to do certain kinds of work, chooses to live in certain parts of the city, chooses to live with his particular community of workers in one neighborhood, all of these are determined by the religious affiliations of the workers, their ethnicity, their caste, their kinship, their language group. Um, Even in fact gender. So this approach, the subaltern studies approach, would help us understand why women from certain constituencies were allowed to choose work as migrant laborers in their own right rather than just following after their husbands, and other women couldn't or did not, right? So a lot of these cultural factors would help us understand the patterns of work, settlement, and movement of migrant workers uh, from the 19th century onwards. As Dipesh Chakraborty has suggested, that the Indian workers' sense of belonging to a clearly defined working class was to a large extent clouded and limited by an older pre-capitalist, even pre-bourgeois cultural consciousness in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it's only through the 20th century that well, from the late 19th century onwards, that this traditional structure of thinking and acting was transformed by their interaction with capitalist production in the city. So while general economic factors explain why migration to the city happens, it doesn't explain why some migrated and others did not. So we need to draw elements from all these three strands, I would suggest: the neoclassical, the structuralist Marxist, as well as the subaltern historiography stance. From all these three, I think we need to take elements to understand or develop a more nuanced perspective uh, as to why some people become migrant workers and some don't. Many choose to stay on in the village, as it were, and not take that very, very alienating, you know, risk, that risk of moving to a city which doesn't really support you in any way. I would refer those of you who are listening in today to the work of Arjan Dehan, Arjan, Dehan, DE space HAAN, who is a scholar who has worked extensively on migrant workers in Bengal, in Kolkata in particular, around the Titagore area. And he's shown us another important perspective, which is that oral histories might actually be the way by which we may achieve a more nuanced understanding, because that the moment you are allowing the worker, the migrant worker, to speak for herself or himself, you get the worker's own sense of who they are, why they migrate. That comes to the center of the narrative. And so Arjan Dehan adds factors to the list that Dipesh Chakraborty has sort of suggested, of culture, ethnicity, language, kinship networks. He says that the nature of one's household, whether you live in a big family or a small family, the network of information and contacts that you have. Nobody goes to a city, without having some apprehension of what to expect there, and usually that comes through news networks. So, say someone from Bihar coming to Kolkata will already have a pre-existing network of information from prior migrants from Bihar who have settled in Kolkata in certain neighborhoods, right? So that network of information and contact is important. Also, of course, we must factor in the larger developments of industrialization and deindustrialization. The fact that you also had through the years of the communist government's rule, a lot of industries becoming sick and shutting down. There was deindustrialization happening in Bengal as well, which led to shifts in the kinds of work that migrant workers sought in the city. Agricultural changes, the shifts coming over the Indian agricultural sort of scene, and of course, what we've talked about, social and cultural constraints that make people take decisions in a certain way. So, what was migration? I'm taking the example of Kolkata because it's closer home to those of us living in Bengal. But much of what I'm saying you could possibly apply or adapt in part at least to your the research that you will do, perhaps, I hope, on migrant workers in your area, particularly around the larger towns, tier 2 cities. So in the 19th and early 20th century then, one thing remained very obvious, which was that Kolkata's Bhadraloks, the so-called emerging middle class, remained completely impervious, except for a few individuals, to the migrant workers. The migrant workers' lives didn't matter. Okay? They found their way into newspapers only when they posed a threat to the economic and social comforts of the emerging middle class or to the city's law and order. As you see in India today, all right, it's only when people agitate at railway stations and bus depots that news channels take notice. It's only when there appear to be threats to the well-being of the middle class from the migrant worker, possibly carrying infection from, other cities back to the state. It's that then when the middle class suddenly wakes up and notices. So as early as 1827, palki bearers of Kolkata, palanquin bearers, all of whom were in fact migrants from Orissa, right? Most palki bearers were Odia. They assembled in front of Fort William and at various ghats along the Hooghly to protest taxation upon them. In 1834, salt workers, Kolkata had a large salt making industry, as you know. They demonstrated in front of the Lat Sahib's house because they were being forced by the then salt diwan, Dwarkanath Tagore, to give a free boatload of salt, uh, right? In 1851, bullock cart drivers of Kolkata went on a strike to prevent taxation on their labor. Today, of course, we have bus drivers, minibus drivers, and conductors going on strike. Then it was bullock cart drivers. In 1859, the Bhadraloks complained, and this, I think you will find this particular anecdote quite amusing. The Bhadraloks of Kolkata complained that their favorite sweet, Sandesh, was not available, and so they wrote in great indignation to newspapers of the time. Sandesh had disappeared from the city. Why? Because the milkmen, the doodwalas of Kolkata, had gone on strike. So you notice that the working classes, the poorer citizens of Kolkata, were only noticeable when they created, as it were, a problem. All right. Most of them lived in Kolkata in overcrowded tiled huts, talir bari, kacha houses, matir bari, with very little sanitary facilities, and they were criticized by the British and the Bhadraloks for being so dirty and filthy. But the Bhadraloks and the British did not realize that, or didn't care to realize that these laborers, the working classes coming in to live in the Kolkata slums, had very little choice. They couldn't afford anything more than that. Very few, you can actually count them on your fingers. Bhadraloks actually tried to do something for the migrant workers. So Keshav Chandra Sen, Shoshipada Bandyopadhyay, they tried to improve the lot of poorer classes through means such as starting vocational training institutes, educating the workers through evening classes. But most of these efforts failed, and they failed because the middle class and the elites were quite disconnected from the mass space. They were imposing a kind of top down idea, mainly borrowed from British reformers like Mary Carpenter, of morally reforming and improving the laboring classes to improve their moral fiber so they would just become more efficient and docile, better behaved workers. So this idea of the moral improvement of the poor was completely out of touch with the realities of the poor people. You know, even today, I think the middle class in India imagines that just because it has improved its own lot through education, a fairly useless education if you look at the content of school syllabi even today, the same solution applies to the artisans, workers, craftsmen also. Is that really the case? Is something that I would want you to think about. I mean, saying that we can improve the lot of the working classes and peasants and artisans by giving them the same education that middle class people have. Uh, I don't think that kind of catch-all strategy worked in the 19th century, and it doesn't work even now. On the other hand, you also have the fact that many of these migrant workers in Kolkata in the colonial period were being frequently displaced. Because as the city was growing, new buildings were coming up, new construction was happening, and many of these slums, temporary dwellings of migrant workers would be shifted. They would be given land elsewhere, told to shift elsewhere. So even within the city, there was displacement happening as it continues to happen now. Why weren't they being able to organize or unionize in the late 19th century? Um, Largely because traditional clan loyalties, caste loyalties prevented one clan or one caste from mixing with other clans and castes. There was also, as I said, displacement happening physically, and there were migrants coming in, as I said, from Orissa, Bihar, what is now Jharkhand, UP, speaking different languages, dialects, that prevented organization or mobilization. So, it's ironic that when there were peasant rebellions, tribal rebellions happening across eastern Indian countrysides, the migrant labor in Kolkata, the working classes in Kolkata didn't really show any solidarity for them. There was very little mass mobilization simultaneously in the city. In fact, they were changed and alienated by their circumstances of living within the city from these mass movements that were happening elsewhere. So, and of course, they were also cut off from their own villages by lack of communication and physically struggling for their daily bread in a city where they hadn't yet developed a collective identity. While you have peasant rebellions, the rebellion of Titumir, and many other Adivasi and peasant uprisings happening, nothing happened in the city as such. So by the end of the 19th century, then only a very small section of unorganized migrant laborers who were part of the industrial working class. So, the jute mill workers, the cotton mill workers, and so on, had begun to organize themselves for better working conditions. A very small number. As is the case even today, the middle class only noticed them when their own sense of entitlement to the services provided by these migrant laborers was threatened. A important fact that Arjan Dehan points out, Arjan Dehan is interesting because he doesn't commit himself to any of the three major theoretical strands for the study of migrant labor that I pointed out, but attempts a more syncretic kind of work using oral history as his tool. He suggests that one of the reasons why people also didn't completely identify with their role as working class citizens and agitate for more improved living conditions was that they often had a continuing link with the land back home, Desh. And this, I think, has come back into our consciousness in the current crisis. This desperate need to get home when the promised land of the city has nothing more to offer them. So, they connected with their, continue to maintain connections with their home villages. So very often you would have the male members, younger members coming to the city to work, while the rest of the family, including women, would often stay back in the village. And so they would send money to the village if they managed to find a job. If they manage to find a job, interestingly, in the case of South Indian migrant labor, in the case of Bihari migrant labor in Kolkata, we find that they would then bring more people from their village to stay and work in the city, and they form little sort of ghettos or little concentrations, across Kolkata. Um, of course, caste was a major push factor that pushed people out of the villages. Entire families of migrant labor migrated from South India to Kolkata to get away from the caste system, the oppression in their villages. There is also the phenomenon, of course, of the seasonal migration. So when it's paddy harvesting season, rice harvesting season, you also have very large numbers of migrant laborers, seasonal laborers coming in to work with the harvest. But many who came in initially as migrant laborers with a cyclic pattern or seasonal pattern of migration to the city from the village. By the first quarter of the 20th century, uh, indeed, I would say more substantially from the mid 20th century, you have many of these families choosing to settle down in Kolkata in slums. So many of the slums of Kolkata are actually heritage in the sense that you have slums that go back 150 or even more years across Kolkata. So many migrants still maintain, if they have property in the villages, they try to maintain that property in the village, or at least go back for family functions. So that link with the village remains in the case of a lot of the migrant workers who have chosen to settle down. Um, so migrants came then to industrial areas, but migrant workers are not confined to the city. They can, as it were, return. They can try for other jobs. They can reconnect with older family professions. So, even when most of the family had migrated to the city or settled there, the place of birth, the desh, remains important, both in terms of affect and always as a fallback measure, as we have seen in the current migrant worker crisis, the need to somehow get home. Um, so while migrants had some choice, have had some choice, it doesn't mean that they were free to choose. Right? People had to choose. It was a compulsion to choose whether to stay in the village or to migrate to the city. To which city, where in the city, what work in the city they chose to do. All of this depended on the networks of people known to them who were already in the city or facilitating work in the city. I've already told you about the migrant workers who were indentured laborers going overseas. They were always recruited by sardars or arkatiyas and brought to Kolkata, often in fact deluded into thinking that their journey stopped in Kolkata, but they would very often then be sent off on ships overseas. Um, so it's not just about the networks. It's that even it's not just external forces. There were alternatives, possibilities, you know, even the sudden individual, familial, or large-scale changes, that influence their individual decisions about working in the city. Um, and these decisions, why they chose to, you know, go to the city, why they chose to come back, leave the city, all of these only come through when you will, actually go and talk to the migrant workers and interview them and do their oral histories, which is why I think I'm choosing today as a way of pitching this, which is that perhaps, in the coming months and years, we are able to document this, massive displacement to which we have all been witness. Um, we have to understand that through the 1930s and 40s, then many of the families that had come in as migrant laborers to the city chose to settle down. Um, I would refer you to Nitai Kundu's very exhaustive report on the slums of Kolkata, a report that came out in 2003, to understand how, as we move from the colonial period to, independence and thereafter, to indeed now the new liberal city, uh, you know, so much has changed in terms of, why there is now an even greater demand for informal, unorganized sector workers, why the city pulls them, as it were, attracts them, as we have seen now, to only leave them in the lurch in times of crisis. Um, Now, the history of labor then in India, migrant labor, so far has ignored the perspectives of those who were being studied, the hopes and aspirations of laborers, the socio-cultural reasons why they migrated or returned. And while the scale and form of migration has changed, when I was doing my research on the migrant laborers in the colonial port of Calcutta, I found that a lot of the personal narratives that existed provided a wonderful way of understanding the lives of migrant workers, men and women in the city, uh, which statistics and data didn't quite provide in terms of richness. And which is why it's important then that you facilitate the coming to voice of migrant workers so that their stories are told. They tell their own stories, perhaps through your mediation. Um, it's not just about journalists reporting about migrant workers, it's also about you bringing to voice their own stories, where they tell their lives, as it were. So, I hope that, it's becoming a little clearer that not all slum dwellers in a large city, tier one cities like Bombay, Bangalore, Kolkata, not all slum dwellers are necessarily migrant workers, right? Um, I mean, the fact that, as the city of Kolkata grew, you have more and more laborers coming in, finding cheap accommodation, mostly huts made of, bamboo and mud constructed by middlemen. These were known as the Thika tenants, right? And these middlemen in turn leased out that land on which they rented out these mud homes to laborers from uh, landlords. So you had this proliferation of huts across the city as a basic infrastructure for migrant laborers, and these were rented out, right? So I want you to understand that the city, as it's growing, right, and entering in a sense into full-scale liberal capitalism, it is also a space of rent, right? not just rent for the middle class or the elite, but rent for the poor and the working classes. Now, this growth of slums under the Tika tenancy system continued unabated, and most vacant areas of the city filled up. So you have, these form the well-defined, as I said, historical slums of Kolkata today. And most individuals from slums like these in Kolkata, Mumbai, or Delhi would not return to their villages except for perhaps family visits or occasionally at time of harvest and so on. So if these are second generation or third generation slum dwellers, they would see the city itself as home. Which is not the case with the first generation migrant worker newly coming into the city, and who, in a sense, becomes what is termed transit labor. There is always a home to return to, the city is not home. In Nitai Kundu's study of the Kolkata slums, it was found that 41% of the people, the households in the slums of Kolkata have been living there for more than 2 generations. Most of the households are settled on a permanent basis. And so there would be the squatter slums, people squatting on government land that they've occupied on their own, not necessarily with legal documents. You also have the Tika system that I described. Um, but there are also the refugee colonies that were regularized by governments, after the partition and then after the Bangladesh Mukti Juddha, when you had a large number of refugees coming in. You also have small plots of land bought by residents from the local landowner, on which shanties or hutments are raised. Land tax is paid, and the dwellers have legal ownership, uh, access to water and electricity. But it is the Tika tenancy system that creates the slums, which have a lot of rooms being rented out. In fact, one family staying in the room in the veranda of that same house, another family is staying. All right, tremendously congested slums. And these slums, the Tika tenancy slums, have a very high proportion of floating migrants or seasonally migrating tenants. Okay. So, and then of course you have camps, tents, kind of shanty towns that come up alongside large construction projects, such as when the metro was being constructed, you had slums of migrant workers coming up along the bypass. Um, some of my students in the diaspora studies course had actually done a very interesting oral history project with some of these seasonally migrating workers along the bypass. So it's important to understand, as the city um, tier 1, tier 2 and tier 3 cities of Kolkata of India enter into the liberalization era. The migrant sits in a sense at the heart of that growth of the city, right? Without the figure of the migrant worker, the city, the way it visualizes its expansion, right, uh, is not possible. And yet, um, these post-liberalization, neoliberal cities have done grave injustice to the migrant workers on whose backs these cities are being raised. So the figure of the migrant labor then is critical in the transformation of the city to a rental outlet. As I said, you remember this factor of rent, right? And at the same time, what I had started my talk with, this idea of the city as a massive site of extraction of energy, of resources, all of which go into the building of logistics, infrastructure, and all of which are labor intensive. We need to reflect then on the hidden processes by which the modern city shifts as a site of industrial production, which Kolkata was, say, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, to the site of a more knowledge-based economy, which is what it starts becoming from the late 1990s onwards, right? This, apart from the fact that you need concentrations of, human capital, all right, these are also place-based services. You need a sector 5, all right, you need these large buildings in sector 5, which means that you need certain kinds of infrastructure to support the new knowledge economy as well. So, and who builds those? It is the migrant workers who build the large buildings of the neoliberal city. So, in many ways, the neoliberal city is a very contradictory site. It encapsulates the dilemmas of modern global capitalism, which is that on one hand, you have, more and more global connectedness, a lot of hyper commodification of land, the whole sort of land and property mafia that develops in most of these neoliberal cities. And in contrast to that massive expansion of capital and production, you have the increased marginalization of the laborer, particularly the growth in numbers of people working in the informal, unorganized labor. Life becomes more and more informal, and I don't mean informal in a pleasant way. Informal in the sense that there are no formal structures in terms of social security, welfare, support, um, not for male laborers and certainly not for women laborers or juvenile young laborers, children. So this, I would ask you to think about what Ranbir Shamuddar says in his um, collection of essays, Migrants and the Cities, that came out in EPW, the Economic and Political Weekly, in 2016. This is EPW, June 2016. It is available online if you would like to look at it. I suggest that you too, if you want to think a little more deeply about the question of migrant labor. Firstly, and the 4 points that Shamuddar makes, which I think are important and need to be reiterated here. One is that infrastructure, this massive need for infrastructure in the city, reorganizes the city in a way that not only fragments work, so you have, people working in very segmented sectors, super specialized sectors, even as labor, right? So it fragments works and it reproduces older social conditions. But it also calls for a permanent presence of migrant laborers. Migrant laborers, I mean, it sounds contradictory, but this transit labor moving through the city, working, living in tents and shanties, they need to be a permanent presence in the city. Otherwise, the city's infrastructure cannot develop. Secondly, this reorganized city, in terms of urban governance, according to Shamuddar, has a permanent problem posed by the figure of the migrant worker, the migrant laborer who cannot be settled. He cannot be settled in the way in which, say, refugees were settled when their refugee colonies were regularized by the government, right? So the migrant laborer cannot be settled, but at the same time, the neoliberal city cannot dispense with the migrant labor either. So as a result, the city does not emerge as some sort of, well-organized entity full of, energetic citizens, but it's actually an extremely contentious place. It's a place marked by groups of people, often severely disempowered people, fighting for resources, fighting for space, fighting for rights and their claims and justice. Bhadraloks across India, let alone Kolkata, would not even have noticed the plight of migrant workers had they not agitated by coming out to buses, bus stations, railway stations, in front of ministers' homes, demanding that they be given facilities to safely reach their own homes. And we must remember that when this huge mass of migrant laborers leaves the neoliberal city, one of the most important foundations on which the growth of the city itself is paralyzed, right? So we have these images of laborers who literally, when they reach their home village, kissed the ground, the earth of their desh, their desher mati, saying that we will not go back to the city again. The city has betrayed us. Whatever we had thought the city would give to us, it has failed to do so. And this, we'll have to deal with the consequences of this. When so many laborers have left, governments across states will have no choice but then to impose more draconian labor laws, or indeed dissolve labor laws altogether, so that this kind of model of development, neoliberal development, continues unabated. And that is a very alarming thing to contemplate, the complete breakdown of legal support for workers in the city. So it's this new liberal city retains its links with the old city very much so, which is why I try to show you how the patterns of migration and settlement in colonial Kolkata sometimes seem to be very similar to patterns that we are seeing amongst migrant workers even now. So even in the old city, we had the informal labor sector. There were the urban clashes and conflicts, happening. Now, today, apart from, of course, construction workers, we also have a very large floating population of domestic labor. So you have, for example, in Delhi, a huge number of Bangladeshi refugees working as domestic labor. And for many of them, even though they are migrant labor, where do they go back to? I mean, they have come out of Bangladesh into India as, illegal refugees, literally burning all their bridges. And, Kolkata, large towns in Bengal, Delhi, these provide their only hope of a new life. So, the informalization of work then, the increasing informalization of work then in cities is linked to the availability of migrant labor as well. The fact that even now, since the colonial period to the present day, there are still issues of, the caste system, the class system, causing limited access to land. Right? There are many people in villages who do not have access to land, and therefore for them migration is the only choice they can imagine. That is something that we will have to seriously think about in coming years, as to how to make the rural area itself a place where livelihood and quality of life are vibrant enough to dissuade people from coming to the city in search of a better life. Right? It is time we stop seeing rural areas as a kind of grounds of which large cities parasitically feed. The city has to learn to fend for itself, to cut down on its resource consumption, to reimagine itself in sustainable terms. Right? Rural areas will eventually, I imagine, and it's something that, this being the 50th year of Gandhi's birth, perhaps one might reiterate that once Gram Swaraj really takes off in a big way, the city will realize that it is dependent upon the villages. The villages do not look towards the city. Rural areas do not look towards the city anymore. And that, in a sense, will be the beginning of truly a new India, an India that might be sustainable in environmental and economic terms. So several studies have shown that the construction sector in particular is the most, in terms of migrant workers, the vulnerability of migrant workers, today the most important sector to think about. But what is important to remember is a binary of how the worker and the city interact. Let me give you an anecdote. When coolies, indentured laborers, were being brought in the mid 19th century from rural areas for shipping off to plantations around the world, many citizens of Kolkata, including a community which had never previously mobilized politically or socially, which is the Marwari community, many citizens actually came out of their shells to help migrant workers understand the terms of the contract which they were signing, to help some of them, flee from the sort of camps where they were being held as labor to be shipped off. So, there was a lot of Kolkata itself changed because of the presence of the migrant workers, just as the migrant worker's perception of himself, his sense of belonging, his sense of who he is or who she is also changed. Remember, I gave you the example of how migrant workers from villages in the city, living in the city, did not respond to the peasant and tribal rebellions that were happening at that time in the late 18th or 19th century. It's like the city had changed them in terms of their perceptions. So, the migrant laborer never settles. All right, there is always that home somewhere to which they look, and at the same time, the migrant laborer, the construction laborer, also unsettles the city. So, across tier 1, tier 2 cities, tier 3 cities also, we have these large groups of laborers moving from one construction site to another, reminding us of the 19th century phenomenon of destitute laborers. Laborers who would just roam around in search of jobs, and whatever meager sum you gave them for perhaps a physically very, very arduous task, they would do it. All right. So this idea that the city provides or can provide a better life, perhaps 1 or 2 generations later, that dream drives a lot of people to become, in that sense, transit labor. The phenomenon of transit labor then becomes key to this vision of an economically vibrant India. Hundreds of projects, special economic zones, power plants, airports, railway corridors, highways, bridges, new building projects, flyovers, IT parks, industrial parks, huge sprawls of residential complexes. They don't just need resources like aluminium and steel and cement, but also labor, right? A huge amount of labor. Now, I would like to read here a, a short piece that Professor Supriya Chaudhary wrote when she was deeply disturbed by how the middle class in India was impervious till the crisis hit of the question of migrant laborers. We must realize that most of the people living in the city who are not migrant laborers have very little access to the lives of the migrant laborers because of the way in which they are brought to the city by labor contractors. The whole chain of exploitation keeps them in small closed communities. They don't really, their voices don't really reach others outside. Sorry. um, Can you hear me? Have I accidentally cut myself off, or can you hear me?
You are audible, ma'am. Could you all?
Yes. Okay. Thank you. All right. So to continue from where I had stopped, just think about this. Local labor contractors will go into tribal areas, rural areas, and recruit workers, usually with very low wages, to come to the city. All right. So the local contact brings them, and the labor contractor then, the contact who recruited them gets a cut. The labor contractor then, who then, in a sense, gives out these laborers as, contract labor for various infrastructure projects. He also obviously will get a cut, right? So the salaries they get are anyway depleted. There is no direct transaction, say, between me, who lives in a 5-story building, right, and the laborer who built that building. It is always mediated by a series of contractors, middlemen, and so on. So we don't ever really, rarely do we actually see the construction workers. You move into a house after the construction process is over, by which time the migrant laborer who constructed it has had to move on, right? You don't really get the time to thank them or invite them for your griho probation and so on. The Bhadralok is not that Bhadro at all. So, in a sense, then, they're very often escaping from joblessness because the agricultural sector at home, in their home village, is failing. They're escaping from poverty and caste oppression at home, and they're sucked into a labor economy which is marked by very poor labor practices, very exploitative labor practices, which I fear in the coming months and years will get even worse. Um, Unsafe working environments. You really don't have too many construction workers, for example, being given safety equipment. On an average, I was reading that in a city like Bangalore, one construction worker or migrant labor dies each day. Every day, one migrant laborer dies because of the hazards of their workplace. So, the living conditions also, as I said, these homes that they rent out are often, in slums with deplorable sanitary conditions, highly congested. So imagine in the pandemic, for example, really there is no escape route for people living as, tenants in, say, the Chika tenancy slums and so on. And certainly no escape also for those living under the thumb of the contractor in the tented colonies, the tents and camps, labor camps of large construction sites. Okay, so they're moving from project to project with no work security, and their income is varying seasonally, right, depending upon the demand for labor. Right? The entire family sometimes works on the construction site. There's no sense of a fixed home. You build one building, before it's inaugurated, etc., you've already moved on to the next site. There is no home as such. And which is why, Professor Shupriya Chaudhary asks a very important question. I quote from her wonderful article, which is about the working person's right to life. And I think it's a quote, a substantial quote, but well worth reading in entirety. According to Supriyadi, around 120 million of India's population are seasonal or long-term migrants from rural to largely urban markets. More than 80% of a workforce of around 450 million is in the informal, unorganized sector without assured wages unless they can work. Most have received no wages during lockdown. Professor Chaudhary continues, the task of providing these jobless laborers in state or out of state and their families with food was delegated by the center to the states. Many states are relying on NGOs and volunteer groups in turn to reach the hungry. Rations are insufficient even for those with ration cards. And here is something that she pointed out to me when we were discussing this problem over the phone, which is that, for a lot of people in the unorganized and informal sector, because they're living far away from their homes, they have no ration card. The transit laborer does not have ration cards. And I think the state completely forgot this when declaring a lockdown and imagining that somehow the public distribution system would keep everybody well fed and alive. So, migrants don't have ration cards. Most are not registered with any state labor department, right? As to shelter, the fact that, they cannot pay their rent during the lockdown means that, they face eviction. No matter what, ministers say on television requesting, kind-hearted citizens not to evict their tenants, most people themselves in financial stress will ask for rent, will demand rent, and not being able to pay that. We had this, Shupradi says, very ironically, that Chief Justice Sharad Bobde thinks that migrants don't need money as long as they get food. So in the next phase, Shupradi continues, changes to labor laws will mean less security and longer hours, something that I was also talking about. The decision to walk home pits exploitation, eviction, hunger, and joblessness against the risks of the road, home, family, and possibly work on the land. Which would you choose? So the operative work here is working, she says. And this is something I've tried to say from the very beginning in terms of...
Sorry for the interruption, ma'am. Dr. Dev.
I'll wind up in... Yeah, I'm literally at the end. I'm on my last sentence.
Okay. We would love to hear you continue, but...
I'm actually reading my conclusion.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much.
So, the Indian middle class, remember I told you the story of the Bhadraloks who complained that they weren't getting their Shandesh because the milkmen were on strike, all right? So, it's always this Indian middle class that likes to feel good about donating to the poor and giving relief to cyclone victims and setting up community kitchens, as she says. But, the people we see on the road getting run over by trains, leaving their rotis on the tracks, are not the faceless, nameless poor that the middle class likes to imagine its sympathies lie with. Okay, so it's not just the state, it's us in the cities who don't ask these questions about where the labor for building our cities is coming from. Where do they live? What are they paid? What security do they have? You and I are as responsible as the state, as the government, for the plight of migrant workers today. And you as academics, future academics, teachers, researchers, hopefully social workers, also many of you, you will set this right in your own way. You have been witness to something that is historically deeply moving, deeply disturbing. And I hope that in future, your research, your work will enable the coming to voice of the migrant worker. Thank you.
Aditi?
Thank you, ma'am, for this wonderful and intriguing session. May I now request Professor Owen Mondal, sir, Assistant Professor and Head of the Department of English, Bankura Christian College, to conduct the interactive session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Aditi, and thank you, Dr. Dev, for such an enlightening session. In fact, I was wondering how could a scholar of your stature be so lucid and seamless in presenting things. And this is also a very relevant issue. So I have a number of questions, but I'm sorry I won't be able to continue this for long because our second speaker is already waiting. But we will take 2 or 3 questions, ma'am, if you allow me.
Yes,
Uh,
of course.
yeah, the first question, Rohan, are you there? My friend, Professor Rohan Hassan from Alia
Yes,
University,
yes.
faculty
Oh,
member.
hello,
Yeah, yeah.
Rohan.
Hi, ma'am. Ma'am, it was a, poignant session. I wanted to ask you 2 questions. First
Yeah.
is that, say, if certain lives do not qualify as lives at the very first place, in these certain epistemological frames, so whether they're lost or lived, it doesn't matter. So, do you think that we need to have a reconstructuring of these epistemological frames at the very first place, where
Absolutely.
we acknowledge?
Yeah. Thank you, Rohan. This ties up, of course, with the movements that are happening now about Black Lives Matter, Adivasi Lives Matter, Dalit Lives Matter. And indeed, much of the laboring migrant workers, transit workers are indeed from, minority communities. They are from Dalit and Adivasi communities. So yes, we need to see that intersectionality. That the migrant lives matter needs to be also, I think, as important a hashtag, especially in India right now. And certainly, as I said, the very disciplines in the humanities and social sciences that we have studied are so very bourgeois in their outlook. The very way in which we teach, study, research, the focus of our research is always, the migrant worker, the working classes haven't really featured, right? Except, as I said, the history from below movement. Apart from that, the humanities haven't really, done much in terms of, reaching out or engaging with the narratives of the working classes. You're right, absolutely.
Another connected question. Say, those of us who are at the very heart empathetic about their causes, do we also need to kind of re-examine ourselves constantly? Because whenever we're trying to kind of go on to help them, we're bringing our prejudices, our kind of mental frames. So often it's happening that we're taking away the agencies of their people. Uh, we're
Absolutely.
not.
Yeah.
So
This is the reason I gave that anecdote of the few Bhadraloks who did try to help the working classes in the 19th century. So you had Keshav Sen and Shoshi Paddu Babu and all of these
yes,
people, but they were working from their own ideological assumptions about, we need to improve the working classes' moral fiber and teach them about hygiene and cleanliness and vocational education, and education is the answer. So, they were working from their own sort of biased, sort of understanding, which is why I hope that, the moment you are starting on doing oral history work, ethnographic work, in which the migrant worker is your collaborator, his story is, coming out in his or her voice. That is when your consciousness begins to be transformed. You are engaging with the world on their terms rather than your own terms.
mm,
Right? So that epistemological shift certainly needs to happen. Thank you. Wonderful
thank
questions.
you, man. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohan and madam. The next question is from Pooja Banerjee. Pooja asks, Madam, the so-called migrant workers who struggled a lot to return to their desh or native villages during the pandemic period were not welcomed at their own place. How does the entitlement migrant contribute to this suffering? I would also request you to shed light on the aspect of complicating the idea of desh for these people. Ma'am.
Yeah. Um, the see, it was a return that they hadn't planned on. You see, the decision to leave Desh and go to, Bidesh, the Shahar, is not an easy decision. And once you take it effectively, you are committing yourself to a certain trajectory that, perhaps not this generation, but the next generation will get formal employment, better education, etc. So, this forced return, because of the sudden lockdown, people were suddenly forced to rethink this commitment they had made to the city, because the city was betraying them. The city was no longer a place where, roti, kapra, makan was available as they had imagined it would be available, right? All of a sudden, no income but rent to pay, no income but food, to buy for the family, no income but imagining, how to get transport to, the place of work if at all it hadn't shut down. All of these factors meant that, you know, the only place you return to is home. So even though I think that the question that Pooja is asking about return migrants is that, those who've chosen to become migrant labor, they may have continuing links with Desh, but the commitment to living in the city is something that for them to back down from is extremely unsettling as well psychologically, right? So it's not like they wanted to return so abruptly at all. They were forced, as it were, to take that decision, a choice, about which they had very little choice. Also, the idea of Desh itself, as I said, I mean, that is why I was talking about the colonial period as well. The earlier cyclic pattern of migration, where people worked seasonally in the city and then went back at harvest time, perhaps, to the village to harvest their crops. That particular pattern has shifted. You usually don't have migrant laborers, going back to the village as often, especially if they have a place in the city which they can rent out. It's the fact that they no longer have the money to rent that room or shack or shanty in the city is what then pushes them to go to Desh. So Desh remains an affective site, but it's a site that they're now suddenly being forced to recontemplate as the place where they have to think about earning a living all over again. So it's a double displacement from rural area to city, and then now suddenly, because of the lockdown and now the ensuing recession, returning from city to rural area and imagining a life there. If I could just put in my 2 cents here, which is that perhaps it's the failure of planning itself in India that we haven't been able to make rural economies autonomous, thriving, and vibrant. This desperate focus on urbanization, more and more bigger and bigger cities, that is what has created the problem in the first place. Right? This idea of Desh as a place where you want to stay, because it's actually a place where food is available, that you have abundant resources, you can live well. That Desh, right, was never supported by the state, and which is why, as a migrant worker, you want to go to the city in search of more income, more jobs, because there were no jobs in Desh. So the affective and the economic need to be placed in perspective.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now over to my colleague, Dr. Narugopal Mukherjee. Sir? Dr. Narugopal Mukherjee? Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Nilanjana Dev, for your lucid, fascinating, yet thoroughly researched and utterly exhaustive presentation, and with a mesmerizing voice that seemed to come down from heaven. We all thoroughly enjoyed that, and we would love to listen to you for a further time. But because we have another session today, we had to stop, ma'am. Please pardon us for that. Thank you so much for being with us and also consenting to our invitation from our head of the department. Thank you so much for being with us, and we would love to hear you again in maybe near future. And if you could come physically, as you said, to our college, that would definitely be a great boost to our what I should say, our interactions with you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Now it's over to Arun Mondal again, Professor Arun Mondal, head of the department, to kindly introduce our next speaker, Dr. Richa Joshi Pandey. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee, for giving me the privilege of introducing Dr. Pandey. Dr. Pandey, first of all, I apologize. We had to keep you waiting for quite a long time. Dr. Richa Joshi Pandey is an assistant professor in the Department of English, School of Languages at Doon University, Dehradun, where she has been working since 2014. She was awarded her PhD degree from HNBGU, Garhwal University, Srinagar, Uttarakhand. The topic of her doctoral thesis was historical excavation in the fictional and selected non-fictional works of Amitabh Ghosh. Her areas of interests are as diverse as medical humanities, environmental humanities, Indian writing in English, literary theory and criticism, and gender studies. Dr. Joshi Pandey has participated and presented papers and organized and co-convened various conferences and many prestigious conferences she has co-convened. Uh, Dr. Pandey has also performed various administrative and academic roles during her tenure in Doon University. She acted in the capacity of in charge of the Department of English in the university from 2014 to 18. As an advisory committee member of the Department of English, Doon University, she coordinated and attended various meetings with special focus on syllabi revision, student welfare activities, and other research-based activities for the department. And she also made a presentation to the NAC team on behalf of the Department of English during their visit in 2017. In future, Dr. Joshi Pandey hopes to work in the areas of folk literature and ecology in terms of their parallelisms and resonances, with a special focus on Uttarakhand. Without much ado, I request Dr. Richa Joshi Pandey to kindly begin her deliberation. Dr. Pandey, please.
Thank you, Dr. Mondal. Am I audible? Am I visible?
You are perfectly audible. Please go
on. Thank you so much, and I'm very grateful to you for that very warm introduction. I am completely overwhelmed with the kind of work that Bankura Christian College is doing. The principal and all the esteemed faculty members, thank you so much. I've had a great association with Bengal, as I was telling you earlier, and I always make sure I look for every little opportunity to contribute my little bit to whatever I can whenever any discussion with Bengali institutions and academic institutions happens. I'm very, very fond of Bengal personally. And I would like to thank not only the faculty and the principal of Bankura Christian College. I would also thank the students for being so patient and listening to all the speakers. I've attended some sessions, and I was seeing how the kind of energy and focus and drive and edge that all the students have. It's really great to see. So the kind of energy and focus that has been exhibited by Bankura Christian College and kind of extraordinary and rare commitment that we see by your college and by the kind of academic activities that you keep undertaking is something that that is very rare, and that is really truly something we should all be grateful for. I'm also glad that some of my students I can see as part of the audience. I informed them about these lectures, and they also have been able to benefit from these lectures. So that's again another advantage. Today I'm going to talk about a topic which I have presented a paper on. This paper was entitled "Negotiating Animal-Human Spatial Relations in and Around the Partition" in an anthology of short stories called "Bridge Across the Rivers." Okay, so this is a book called "The Bridge Across the Rivers." It's written by writers who've written not only in English, but some of them have written in Hindi and Urdu, and it's been translated. So the partition of India and Pakistan was an event that involved unprecedented violence. The personal narratives and stories around the partition and its aftermath are compelling in the scope and the nature of the violence that it entails. The victim and the perpetrator of violence, the martyr and the seeker of revenge have narrativized their own stories. In my talk today, I would like to discuss this anthology, Bridge Across the Rivers, whose subtitle, Partition Memories from the Two Punjabs, frames the set of short stories that are situated on either side of the border. I particularly would like to examine animal-human spatial relations and how and what is their import on how we come to occupy the spaces and places that we do. Is there a way to repoliticize spaces? Is there a way to re-inhabit and reoccupy places with the consciousness of this animal-human binary and the humanizing and animalizing process that identity involves? So written by those who were forced to flee their homes and move to new countries, India and Pakistan, these tales really entail the trauma of territorial uprootedness and the death of loved ones. The individual's relations with old and new lands are environmentally embedded. There is a foundational link between people and places in terms of the environmental tropes that abound in these deeply personal stories of loss and alienation. Now, a lot of critics, including critics like Gyan Pandey, have spoken of cultural amnesia. So this violence was so massive and it was so of such an unprecedented scale that it could only, as Gyan Pandey says, quote, can occur only at or beyond that limit, the limit of the community that is unquote. And it must be simultaneous. This kind of violence must be simultaneously owned and disowned. Whether it is a personal act of violence or one that involves the experience of violence, it involves trauma and needs to be constantly relocated in the past in the form of a temporal snapshot. And history and politics hark back to this past, this nostalgia, with a violent othering. So I'm trying to come to terms with this idea of the whole idea of animality and how do we involve ourselves in animalizing while humanizing. And for example, looking at Derrida. Now, Derrida really deliberates on animal-human binary in terms of the material and symbolic violence we do to others in this othering process. And critics have added that, they've argued that this address to human-animal relations also serves as an address to human social relations, human environmental relations. So history and politics, when we talk of othering, this simultaneous owning and disowning of acts of violence, again, is present in history in the form of an interlude in the history of the subcontinent. This interlude also denotes the schism between promise and performance, between the triumphalism of nationalism on the one hand and the vagaries of disconnect, uprootedness, nostalgia, the defeatedness, the defeatism associated with the nation as it exists today. So this interlude is also necessary because it enables the citizen not only to negotiate the irrationality of experience of partition, but also in what is, to negotiate what is carried over from a deterritorialized lived space. So the lived space we know is often manifest in the quotidian. So the survivors' testimonies, for example, about things like the Quran Sharif, the Guru Granth Sahib, they brought with them when they crossed over to the new home. So this crossing over to the new land has been done, and the trauma of all that has been left behind is a permanent void and a state. This also indicates a kind of hope. It also lies at the hallmark of a hope and a promise, despite the new land unable to really emotionally reclaim what has physically been lost. So within this, we see these fragile memories ferry across all worlds. We see the charting of this territorial border, which was very sudden, which was very precarious. At this momentous history in the making, it had sociological, environmental, anthropological dimensions. So the violence of history, its memory thereof, also accompanied and manifested in the sociological, in the environmental, in the individual spaces, involving both the individual and his intimate or his or her intimate community. So the nature of this violence was, on the one hand, precise and situated, and on the other hand, it was indeterminate, continuing and bearing the mark of a collective hysteria. So there was a change in the conditions of living. For example, according to the first Planning Commission report with respect to the urban settlement, India and Pakistan, though they were governed by differing kind of political imperatives, policy approaches, they experienced industrialization and urbanization together. However, there was a difference in the way that the Indian side of Pakistan, the Indian side of Punjab, and experienced partition really compared to the Pakistani side of Punjab, because partition really led to a large and violent uprooting of populations from relatively urban and modernized rural settings in India, on the Indian side of Punjab, to comparatively less developed and rural settings on the Pakistani side. So, this was something that was recorded in the first Planning Commission report. This change in the conditions of living on either side of the border was not on economic terms alone. Large-scale movement during the partition, followed closely by rapid urbanization, abrogated traditional social networks which were situated around metaphors like Sanjha Chulha. So the Sanjha Chula is a community kitchen with a sociological resonance that is based on extension, correlation, and affinity that partakes of and extends the scope of the family. More importantly, so the family projected onto the village community. Now, such an enforced movement violates communities and their social, cultural, and territorial roots, alters significantly the self-conscious relation between the individual and his or her environment. So, severed from one's own fields and the sweetness of its produce, the individual's memories always situate around a deeply personal environmental schema, and these are fragmented forever. So the violence of partition, which is rooted in the environment as a reference point for national and nationalized identities in terms of the relation of the lived reality of human existence. So what was severed was not just land and property, it was a whole lived space and a whole community. What remains are not just fragmentary memories of this lived space rooted in environmental tropes, is the traumatic memories of that inalienable part of the self which cannot be disjointed from the specifics of individual trauma and conflated to a purely nationalized mythic of imagined communities, as Benedict Anderson would have. So imagined communities are marked by borders, and these borders tend to mark the entry of the human against the animalized, non-human other. So categories such as human and animal are essentializing and divisive. The question of animality situates and amplifies the condition of nationalized human exceptionalism. So the issue of negotiating human-animal relations involves a reconceptualization and reconfiguration of spaces and places, as well as our relation to them. And this forms the ethical basis of our continued preoccupation and disavowal of an irrational and irredeemable violence against the non-human animalized other. So if violence lies at the heart of partition, is it important? It is important to address questions that relate to its irrationality. Is it important to locate the specifics of violence, even as it assumes a mythic presence in people's collective memory? Does it run the risk of essentializing identities as violent? Is the ontology of borders closely allied to the ontology of violence? How does violence create categories of human, animal, and animalized others? In the drawing of borders, does violence have both spatial and temporal presence? What constitutes a sufficient response to the way we experience violence? So the denouement of narrative and the enunciation of identity in the face of irrational and inexplicable violence takes the form of textual traces that become clearly locatable in individuals, places, and things. Characters resonate and develop not only through the events of a lifetime, but around those that follow through subsequent generations. So the lived reality continues to congeal and coalesce around the territorial border. And this leads to an unusual flexibility of the narrative of nationhood and borders. These stories, they involve an aggression around the partition and its aftermath, and the border itself is subject to complex and varying kinds of in the face of national destiny. The national border is supposed to contain the human, and it must do so by operating as a spatial metaphor that conditions the possibility of creation of dehumanized subjectivities that are recurrently reproduced around animalizing processes. Yet, the important thing that it draws attention to is which human would claim responsibility for animalizing others? How does the human who fought alongside another of its own kind against the white beast, while himself being named as the beast of burden, justify this violent repetition of the naming process? Now, we know that there's a kind of violence, certain kind of imagination is always active in terms of the naming process. And so, what is how do we come to terms with this humanizing process? And when we speak of Derrida does indeed speak of himself as human. He's not devoted to the metamorphosis of human beings of animal beings into human beings, from animality to humanity, through self-inscription, through self-assertion, through self-inscription, through talking about the political human in terms of self-reflection, through autobiography. Rather, he talks about a certain economy of the animal being alongside, the animal being part of him, or before him, beside him, here and there. So this kind, the human agency. So in this simultaneous reiteration and questioning of the individual's nationalized identity, which is located around the border becomes occluded as the aporia that is at once impossible and yet inevitable to negotiate. The human agency around the construction of a national border cannot be undermined. The new self has to be constantly refashioned in the face of the schism between the individual and his or her relation with the new environment. This is more significant because pre-partition undivided India was largely agrarian. It was more locally rooted, less globally mobile. And with the drawing of the national border, the newly nationalized individual undertook the sharp tracing of contours of the self, where he becomes a gendered subject, and he derives, sustains, and amplifies his power by exerting control over women, by acting as the protector of women, advocating their sacrificial killing in the name of the masculinized ritual of nation building and family or community or the nation's honor. The non-human animal, the environment. So this, he was supposed to be the son of the soil, meant to aggressively protect his turf against the other. The process of othering was a necessary and radical act meant to provide continuous and systemic sanction to the self in times of precarity. The moral compromise enjoined upon the sharp tracing of the borders of the self against the other, and this mimicked the tracing of territorial borders. So In other words, the other was so self-consciously intimate that the process of violent othering required a derivative ethic. The exorcism of the other from within the self had to be done in the name of another entity in order to take away the guilt of murder and make it ethically acceptable. However, partially, it had to be done in the name of something or somebody. This naturalized the prioritization of the nationalized self over the non-nationalized other by guaranteeing full transcendence to the human self. So the act of othering required the creation of categories such as the human and the non-human animal. And in this regard, this may be seen as a repeat of the racist and animalizing ideologies of imperialism. So, speaking of human agency in terms of the capacity to affect the environment and history, Armstrong writes that human animal geographers, I quote, and he writes that human animal geographers have made productive use of the actor network theory that rather than limiting its attention to the conscious, rational choices made by human individuals, considers agency as an effect generated in multiple and predictable ways from a network of interactions between human, animal, and environmental actors, unquote. The stories of partition also gesture towards new ways of conceptualizing animal-human relations. So, Cary Wolfe draws on Derrida, and he writes that the impact on animals and those that are animalized relies upon, quote, a tacit acceptance that the full transcendence of the human requires the sacrifice of the animal and the animalistic, which in turn makes possible a symbolic economy in which we can engage in a non-criminal putting to death, as Derrida puts it, a non-criminal putting to death, not only of animals, but other humans as well, by marking them as animals. So for Wolfe, violence towards the animal and animalized others is justified as part of a wider humanist discourse, quote, available for some humans against other humans as well, to countenance violence against the social other of whatever species, of gender, of race, of class, of sexual difference. So every other becomes another animalized other, another entity that has gone through this animalizing process, devolved from that status of the human. In a Gambian terms, it would mean moving from, a devolutionary process, moving from bios to zoe, in that sense. So made Homo sacer, or analogous to Homo sacer. Julie Matthews works in the area of animal geography, and she infers that, quote, the question of the animal serves as an address to the violent materialities and imaginaries of geography itself. It brings questions of responsibility and ethics into historical and locational context, and requires an understanding of how we come to be in this condition, how it disorders and calls all our actions into question, and how we might differently occupy spaces and places, unquote. So in a short story called One's Own Country in this anthology, it's a short story that harks back to the fields that have been left behind. And there is a character, Barkat Bibi. She remembers the sweetness of the corn, the radishes, carrots, and water of the country that she's been severed from. She says, quote, take it away. It is tasteless. Oh, Bashiran baby, what lovely corn we had in our own country. This corn, she flung out her arm in disgust. Barkat Bibi and Bashiran have experienced firsthand the moment of rupture, of the impossibility of feeling the sweetness of taste in the crop that the new land produces. Their memories are environmentally coded in the touch, taste, smell, and feel of the only land they can recall as theirs, for all else is tasteless. The loss is permanent and irrevocable and entails a death and life situation, capable of drawing life away even as it is lived in the present. Which is one's own country, after all, is a question that has no easy answers in the language register of a new nation in terms of one that involves a certain naming process. Everything is done in the name of producing that nation. It's accompanied by its own logos. The transcendental constant of a new nation is a repoliticized and reconfigured imagined space that oppressively and violently fails to factor in the old web of interconnections between an individual and his or her immediate environment, which leads to a schism between the individual's interior and exterior lives. The psychic economy offered through the medium of the short story enables a space for a renegotiation of the complex and inchoate shards of memory and desire in Barkat Bibi's story of a continuing trauma that is impossible to mitigate. So the author writes, the corn cobs roasting in the ashes crackled. The smoke from the cow dung cakes choked their throats. Then her mind reflected her anguish. The shards of Barkat Bibi's nostalgia for her lost home are accompanied by the pain of the killing of her whole family. Her entire family has been killed. In response to the young and ambitious Nazir Ahmed, he's preparing for his class 12 exam. He's far younger, and he constantly questions Barkat Bibi. Who killed your whole family? The killer was definitely a Singh. He mentions specifically his refrain after everything that Barkat Bibi says. Every time she just shuns that whatever the new land has to offer, and he says, "Who killed your whole family?" The killer was definitely a Singh. Barkat Bibi vehemently disapproves and exonerates from the charge of animality the names of specific individuals, people who had been part of her milieu, Karnail Singh, Kaptan Singh, people who had been real individuals, part of her milieu. And she remarks, yes, Nazir Ahmed, but that Singh had no name. While Karnail Singh and Kaptan Singh are full, real human figures characterized by empathy, rationality, capable of spontaneous and unrestricted human-to-human dialogue, Bibi specifically locates that Singh in terms of a demonstrative pronoun, purely in terms of the violence he demonstrates. That Singh is separated from her, physically, emotionally, metaphysically, in space and time. On the other hand, the vehemence in Nazir Ahmed's recurrent reiteration of a Singh, the killer was definitely a Singh. As a Singh, that Singh is a murderer. Metonymically, a Singh identifies all Singhs as murderers, wild, unempathetic, illiterate beings capable of doling out irrational, both in form and extent, irrational forms of violence. An animal as a generic category, separate from his own human aspirational self. Ahmed's words and his response suggest the possibility of an escalation of violence, which is absent in Bibi's words. In the face of an unmitigated trauma of the past that both Barkat Bibi and the young Nazir Ahmed have faced, there's a difference in the response. So Ahmed, for him, there's a sense of potential escalation of violence. Another short story, Khabal or Perennial Grass, is the story of an unnamed woman in Pakistan. She is unnamed, which gestures towards stories of women on either side of the border. Humiliated and trampled, she has been forcibly abducted, converted, married, and or raped. However, even for her, everything is not lost. She hopes to find her sister-in-law, and even in the delirium of fever, she begs the narrator, a liaison officer in the Indian government, to locate her and unite the two. The narrator is reminded of the khabal, the fresh green grass that sprouts naturally and perennially in this region. The old Jat had remarked, when we till the land, do we leave it, khabal, there, We pull it out, root by root, and throw it away. But 10 days later, you will find it sprouting in the field. On either side of the border, the pulling out of cabal generates the same emotional and ethical responses culturally. The violent subjugation of nature, the instrumental man subjugating nature, justified in terms of an abstract space subject to human instrumentalism, is mapped on here to a phallic space that justifies mistreatment and violence towards women, particularly women of the other country or other religion, as non human animalized others. The despair is universal, and environmental metaphors confirm the environmental embeddedness of our contextualized relations and intersubjective encounters within animal human spatial relations. In Kabal, the water in the new residence canals is red and unfit for the performance of wuzus, which is an ablution performed as a religious rite by Muslims involving the washing of hands, feet, and the face, and indicates purity before God. Praying, notions of purity and cleanliness are human attributes, while killing and murder are indicative of barbarism only an animal is capable of. However, the questions that one must ask or one is compelled to ask are that who are the ones who have committed the barbarism? Who are the ones to have been killed? And who are in fact capable of purity are questions that easily risk the inversion of the human animal binary or interrupt the human animal binary. So the red canals full of corpses and mutilated bodies of those who have been non-criminally put to death are environmentally coded reminders of internal contradictions about animality and complicate the limits of the human animal binary. Another story, The Homecoming. Mehtab Deen has undertaken a perilous and arduous journey with his friend Sant Singh and family. Sant Singh's daughter Bachno is just about the age of Mehtab's own daughter Tajo, whom he has left in the village since she was an infant. He grows very fond of Bachno and promises her that once they reach their own country, he would introduce her to Tajo and they would be friends. So ultimately, they reach home, and in a tragically ironic turn of events, Sant Singh and his family are attacked by a mob of Muslim rioters. The attack is fatal. Bachno is profusely bleeding, but she's still alive. Mehtab, sensing that his friend may be in danger, goes to his rescue. But just as he is about to save this orphaned Bachno, he's stabbed in the back by the remorseless rioters, who also attack Mehtab. He's a Muslim himself, simply because he's trying to save Bachno. And the dying Bachno is attacked once again by the rioters who shout out, "Kill this snake also." Not long ago, when Mehtab had taken refuge in the Gurudwara with Sant Singh's family, a few Sikhs had cornered him, saying that a Musalman is a snake. In both cases, the reptilian metaphors are culturally striking, and they suggest human distrust and disgust with the animal. The mythic end to the story, silence of history, idiomatic of a rough-shorn, ritualistic, and beastly death orgy, is something. The story ends with a loud siren calling for a curfew. It's analogized as the howling of the village dogs before a death. This land, with its reptilian and beastly preoccupation, threatens the integrity of the human projection of the nation state as an imagined community, and this can be read as the imaginative failure of the nation as one's own land. In Blackwater's Dark Well, another short story, two young and innocent lovers, Gurbaksh and Balli, jump into a well and commit suicide. They've not really committed suicide. They're not killed because of the partition or because in the violence of the partition. However, their story is framed within the story of the partition because they commit suicide in an atmosphere of panic and fear. The well is a leitmotif in the story. It's an important symbol of the human, suggesting the thrum of rural life where village communities draw water. It's the symbol of life, sustenance, cultural collectivism, power, and the human potential for technology. It is also a symbol for discrimination. for violence, suicide, ignominy, contagion, and death. So, as the violence of warring religious factions looms large in the backdrop of the nation's partition, the two young lovers are overwhelmed by this immediate fury of violence that surrounds them. And the logic of domination and territorial control overdetermines the rivalry between two families that cannot see eye to eye. And the fallout is borne by the innocent love that is crushed before it can bloom. So, Balli and Gurbaksh are rendered in a state analogous to bare life. They have no juridico-political recourse. This is an example where the rhetoric of nationhood becomes coterminous with patriarchy and elides over the danger of two marginalized individuals being reduced to bare life. So, in Derridian terms, Balli and Gurbaksh, as animalized others, are non-criminally put to death. In one's own country, another short story, Nek Begum, like several other women during the partition, commits suicide by jumping into the well. The menfolk instruct them to do so in order to save their own honor and that of their families. As gendered and animalized others, women are subject to gang rapes, forced marriages, suicidal killings. These acts are justified as acts of exception, with the conflation of the woman as a species and as the other that may be killed and yet not sacrificed. Without a Homeland is another story narrated by a young editor who finds it difficult to secure accommodation in a big city. After a number of failed attempts, an elderly professor agrees to rent a room to him. He has lost his home in Pakistan and he wants freedom not from the British colonizers, but from those who colonized thought in the name of borders and nations. So he's confronted by the narrator and he bursts out saying, "Your country? Is it your country? You who have to go around wagging your tail like a wretched dog to rent a room." The dog analogy here is significant because it bears the mark of impatience and disgust culturally located around a wretched and abandoned stray who doesn't belong, who's not meant to belong, and whose life is an empty signifier. In the last story, The Ointment, Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs have lived as a community through years of goodwill and peaceful coexistence. In the run-up to the partition, however, as terror pervades the Muslims residing in a village, which is on the Indian side of the border, Dhanna's marauding gang is out on a rampage to loot, kill, and rape. He bursts out saying, "Who informed these musallas? If I get hold of the traitor, I swear by the Guru, I'll kill him like a dog." At the same time, the writer transposed the animal imagery of the dog with the sexualized imagery of Meherban's dead daughter's breasts. So just as he's saying this, Dhanna looks at Meherban's dead daughter, and her breasts that are uncovered. And it says, the narrator says, Dhanna's eyes flickered over her breasts. Now, this is a reversal of animality. It shows the scavenging animal that Dhanna really is. He's calling someone else a dog, but he's doing just what a beast or an animal is supposed to do. And so the writer transposed the animal imagery of the dog with the sexualized imagery of Meherban's dead daughter's breasts, justifying the violence that the simultaneously animalized and sexualized other is subject to. The complex web of violence undercuts the identity of the Indian and the Pakistani. Now, what these examples have shown us is the fact that the very process of animalizing the other, the very process involved in animalizing the other in order to claim the human self, the self-inscribed human self, and that becoming visible, the visibility of that animalizing process. The complex web of violence undercuts the identity of the Indian and the Pakistani. The two categories involve a mutual animalizing of the other in order to sharply define the human self. Calling each other a dog is an act that involves the stripping of the human of the other or dehumanizing the other. And this presupposes the abject animalization that the fully human may subject the animalized other to. So there's another risk here involved here. So this animalizing process, the visibility offered through the psychic economy offered in the scope that the short story offers, this visibilizing of this process of animality that the human subjects the other to, is something that draws attention to how the human and the animal are mutually constituted, the aporia that exists, how they are mutually constituted, and yet affirmative. So because if that had not, in the absence of this visibility, in the absence of the visibility offered by this animalizing process itself, and the limits offered to the human, there could be a tendency towards voyeurism, towards a kind of ventriloquism of whatever is missing, or whoever is missing. As the various characters in the stories from this anthology depict, there are no easy or clear answers to questions of belongingness and denial. In the face of dehumanizing violence, the human-animal binary, as well as the problem of language, needs to be re-examined. So, Lowe takes up from Derrida, and he stresses the need to pluralize ontologies, quote, pluralize ontologies, take up what is outside of official consciousness, what is not only difficult to articulate, but inarticulable, theorizing extra-linguistic rhetorics of relation and sensation, unquote. So the crudely reductive categories of Indian, Pakistani, Hindu, Muslim prompt a need to pluralize ontologies, take up what is outside of official consciousness, what was not only difficult to articulate but inarticulable, as Lowe points out. Language really it involves performative symbols, and these are inserted into the rhetoric of speech, and new binaries may be generated that completely undercut and break away from the hegemonic and normative character of the previous ones. In The Ointment, the short story The Ointment, after the Muslims' exodus from Nauru Nangal, Jats and Brahmins from the other side of the border have settled in, and their cultural codes, their dress, mannerisms, and language are strange and alien to the old inhabitants. The masjid, which has been transformed from a gurudwara by ceremonially installing the Guru Granth Sahib, continues to be called Masjid Wala Gurudwara. Now, this is a failure of language in representational terms, but this is also the triumph of relationality, the always already hybrid self that is necessarily pluralized and indeterminate. In another short story of one's community is a short story about two families, one Hindu, the other Muslim. Both have suffered the trauma of violence during partition, and now years later, they are experiencing psychoses, hysteria, psychological illnesses which cannot be diagnosed, and whatever can't be diagnosed has no prognosis. So this unutterable stress of the trauma of partition still persists. The writer, Mr. Sarna, and his neighbor suffer from similar bouts of restlessness and despair. So he says, we have the same illness because we belong to one community, the cruel and the meek. Our two families belong to the community of the meek. The border creates the border creates the binary of Hindu majority India versus Muslim Pakistan, where mutually speaking the other on the other side of the binary is not only adversarial, but also designated as the impure, the unnatural, the animalized, the less than human other. Both sides of these binaries have aggressed, and national borders have been created around the practice of animality and the violent animalizing of the other. However, pluralized ontologies, like cruel and meek, involve a radical reworking of the reductive binaries based around borders. They do not essentialize identities, they disperse and proliferate them outside of official consciousness of human and animal categories that would otherwise involve naming practices which are violent in the way that they imaginatively represent other places and spaces. Constantly, these places, this naming process, this involves a violence where the gap between the human and the animal as generic categories is constantly amplified. The only possible binary here, in the case of calling oneself in terms of cruel and meek, and not Hindu, Muslim, not Indian, Pakistani, cruel and meek, the only possible binary here is centered around the victim, who is meek, and the aggressor, who is cruel. The position of the meek is a morally prioritized position, however, lacking in its suggestion of the virility claimed by a son of the soil, compared to the cruel that is morally lacking and simultaneously capable of great strength and brute force in its ability to inflict grievous violence. Here, the creative resurgence of the meek does not require the border as a reference point at all. The terms meek and cruel cannot easily be fitted around the human-animal divide with a reference to nationalized religious identities. In fact, in this dispersal of humanity and animality, there is a parallel reference to a different ethical position. What ethical position is that? That is individual responsibility in our ethical relationship to other places and people. So there is a dispersal of humanity and animality, and here that dispersal of humanity and animality leads to a parallel reference to individual responsibility in our ethical relationship to other places and people. So to conclude, I would like to say that partition and its aftermath require a careful re-examination of the violence that is normally located around political and territorial borders, and studies in animal-human geography may help relook at questions of identity that define and sustain the animal and the animalized other for the constant and renewed reproduction and of the human. So this is particularly important because this partition is the singularly unprecedented event that happened in the history of, even though the partition was really a very long affair than just one event. It was a very, very long affair. Also, the partition is not just the partition of Punjab, but the partition of Punjab and Bengal. And the partition of India and Pakistan continues today to have a contemporary political resonance, but it also has a mythic relevance for the people of the subcontinent and their lived reality of existence. And so it is very important to examine other ways to repoliticize and reoccupy spaces and places and our relations to others. So I'd like to wind up here, and am I audible? Hello?
Yes, you are audible, Doctor.
You are audible.
Yeah, that's about it. I'd like to take questions if there are any questions.
Thank you, ma'am, for this extremely engaging lecture. May I now request Dr. N.G. Mukherjee, sir, Reader, Department of English, Bankura Christian College, to host the interactive session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Aditi, for giving me a chance once again. Now the floor is open to ask questions directly, or you can put your questions in the chat box. Thank you so much, Dr. Richa Joshi Pandey, for being with us and for responding to our invitation.
Thank you.
Now,
thank you.
Yeah, questions. Now the floor is open. You can ask questions directly.
Hello, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, please.
Hello. First of all, thanks a lot, ma'am, for this wonderful session. I have a small observation regarding the whole talk. You were referring to actor network theory, right? So
Yes.
I would like to know from you that do you consider that a post-human imagination or a post-human society would rather emancipate this binary and hegemonic domination between the animalistic and the humanistic?
Absolutely. Post-humanism, in fact, first of all, thank you for the question. That's precisely what post-humanism intends to do. Post-humanism really disperses identities, not only restricting them in terms of animal-human, but this probably would be the rite of passage. But what post-humanism does is, in fact, look at the broader scope of what it is to be human. Again, we've moved beyond this animal-human divide when we talk of post-humanism. We've already, as you know, we've come to that stage where we've spoken of this dispersal of identities. So, in a way that we have inherited this whole thought of transhumanism, and now, so as post-humanists would say that you have to be before you are a humanist, you have to already be post-humanist in that sense. So yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you both Soikal Chakraborty and Dr. Pandey. Now, is there any other question for her? Yeah, this is from Srishti Raturi. Thank you so much, ma'am, for such an enriching lecture. My question is, how would you examine this idea of animality in today's scenario of pandemic situation? Okay, so now we have responded.
Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. I'm so privileged to. I feel so privileged to answer a question put up by you. So first of all, thank you for your question. To talk about animality in terms of the pandemic, it's so pertinent because the way that patients have been subjected to this whole animalizing process. So even when we talk of people who've been infected with COVID-19, the entire discussion ranging around COVID-19, strays, whether stray dogs or stray animals should be encouraged or no, or should we go close to them or no. There are so many myths that are associated with it. Everything ultimately boiling down to COVID-19, and that becoming the center of everything that would characterize the other. So even when we talk of this idea of let's not discriminate against COVID-19 patients. Why? The reasons being that we can use their plasma. We can use the plasma for treatment. So the fact is that again, this us-them binary and this animalizing process that they could be subjected to is something that we need to re-examine, and we need to really posit ourselves in a broader space. People coming from outside, people coming from overseas into the country's borders and crossing the country's borders. So the entire debate around this territoriality and the integrity of us versus something that could potentially reek of the virus involves again an animalizing process that functions through a certain stigma in the society today. I wonder if that.
Thank you so much. Actually, it was a question from Srishti Raduri. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay, the next question is from Sokarjo Ghoshal. Is the reading of the text possible from a deep ecological perspective? Ecological perspective.
Well, from deep ecology, I'm talking about environmental embeddedness. I'm talking of the relationality of the individual in terms of this whole violence that we offer and is invariably going to be offered. So as I was trying to mention, Derrida, I mean, there is no scope for this deep ecology in terms of just looking at a space as it is in itself, because there's going to be, we can't rid ourselves of this animalizing process. Not that I'm upholding it, but this contour between us, between the human and the animal is not something we can do away with. That would again be a bit of a voyeuristic position to take. What must happen, in fact, is try and examine spaces in terms of dispersed identities, and just try to move beyond, look at pluralized ontologies, look at spaces beyond our relation to them in terms of marking the self from the other.
Thank you so much. Just the last question that we would like to take now from Jyotirmoy Poti. Ma'am, during partition, should government be more active to prevent the violence? This is something a generalized question, and we know the answer.
Well, I'm not a politician. I'm only, and I'm not a historian. So I can only try and look at it ethically. I can only try and look at it in terms of the narrativized encounters, and how we can assume different ethical positions rather than just this one ethical position where we tend to posit the human self versus the animal, versus through an animalizing process. Let's not be blind to this animalizing process that happens, or that invariably involves itself around national boundaries. Let's not be blind to that. Let's foreground that and then acknowledge that and then talk further.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey. Now over to Aditi. Aditi once again.
Thank you, Dr. Indu Mukherjee sir. Now I request Tathagata Bose, postgraduate SEM2 student of the Department of English, Bankura Christian College, to officially conduct the vote of thanks. Over to you, Tathagata da.
Thank you, Aditi. I feel privileged enough on behalf of the Department of English, Bankura Christian College, our indebtedness to the two erudite resource scholars today, Dr. Nilanjana Dev Madam and Dr. Richa Joshi Pandey Madam, who have been kind enough to spare their valuable time for today's lecture despite their hectic schedule. On behalf of all the participants, I acknowledge with sincere gratitude and thankfulness some new perspective in studies and further researches that have been opened up through their insightful and extremely engaging deliberations. I hereby acknowledge the participation of huge number of faculty members of different institutions, research scholars, and students over Google Meet or YouTube Live. They have been patient enough to listen to the lectures with rapt attention and inquisitive enough to interact with our revered resource person. I take this opportunity to put on record the immense logistic and moral support that our respected principal sir, Dr. Fotik Boron Mondal, has extended to the department. Last but not the least, I would like to thank one and all involved in different ways in hosting the seminar, being our respected teachers, students, and the office staff who have been benign enough to extend all kinds of cooperation to make this lecture reach its target. We will meet again tomorrow at 11 a.m. with two eminent speakers, Professor Amrit Sen Sir, Professor of English, Vishwabharati University, and Dr. Oindirla Ghosh Madam, Associate Professor of English, Diamond Harbour Women's University. Please join us tomorrow at the scheduled time. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
And thank you all. Richa,
Thank you, Dr. Joshi Pandey. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Mondal, and thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. I'm so honored. I'm feeling so blessed, and I have had a wonderful association with you. I hope that I could do my little bit in whatever you proposed that I should do.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.